Welcome. Today, we're covering the discussion we had with Professor Ethan Kaplan. He's the professor of economics out of the University of Maryland, part of our one question series. Ethan Kaplan is the associate professor of economics at the University of Maryland at College Park. Before joining the University of Maryland in 2011, he was an assistant professor of economics at the Institute for International Studies at Stockholm University, and he obtained his PhD from UC Berkeley in 2005. Ethan Kaplan joined the department as an assistant professor in 2011. Before joining the department, he had previously been an assistant professor at economics at the Institute of International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. His main areas of research is empirical political economy and applied microeconomics. His research that has focused on media economics, the determination and persistence of political preferences, interest group behavior, and the political economy of U.S. intervention. So he's an expert in this subject matter. He's an associate professor at the University of Maryland. And again, his work focuses on political economy, economic inequality, and empirical macroeconomics. He has taught at Maryland at College Park, Stockholm University, also Columbia University, and he also at UC Berkeley. Very well-educated man who's taught at many universities around the world. This was the article that we reached out to him for. Political polarization and the dynamics of political language, evidence from 130 years of partisan speech. This came out in 2012. So this study's from 2012, about 10 years ago. Here's what the study said. We used the digitized congressional record and the Google Naigrams corpus to study the polarization of political discourse and the diffusion of political language since 1873. We statistically identify highly partisan phrases from the congressional record and then use these to impute partisanship and political polarization to the Google Books corpus between 1873 and 2000. We find that although political discourse expressed in books did become more polarized in the late 1990s, polarization remained low relative to the late 19th and much of the 20th century. We also find that polarization of discourse in books predicts legislative gridlock, but polarization of congressional language does not. Using a dynamic panel data set of phrases, we find that polarized phrases increase the frequency in Google Books before their use increases in congressional speech. Our evidence is consistent with an autonomous effect of elite discourse on congressional speech and legislative gridlock, but this effect is not large enough to drive the recent increase in congressional polarization. So, political discourse expressed in books did become more polarized in the late 1990s. Polarization remained low relative to the late 19th and much of the 20th century. Polarization of discourse in books predicts the legislative gridlock, but polarization of congressional language does not. So some very heavy polarizing language in Congress, and it has been increasing, but can you draw a direct line between the increased use of polarizing language in Congress and gridlock? And he's saying no. So just because more politicians are talking in a more polarized manner does not mean necessarily that Congress will automatically not work. And again, his study came out in 2012, and it looked at 130 years of partisan speech. So I said, hey, you wrote your paper in 2012. Is political polarization worse now, 10 years later? Again, you wrote this in 2012. You were watching how Obama was being treated. You were worried at the polarization that you saw in America, and now it's worse. Or do you not think so? So is polarization worse than when you wrote your book in 2012 documenting it? The quick answer from casual observation is yes. Political polarization is definitely worse now than it was in 2012. The more nuanced answer is it depends on what you mean and how you measure it. Do you mean partisan polarization among federal legislators? If so, Republicans and Democrats seem to be voting more differently, as you can see from DW nominate. There is greater separation on average between the parties and no overlap in partisan orientation. We've seen many professors say that. Just got done 2 interviews today. The parties used to have some overlap. Now there's no overlap, and they're more ideologically sorted. So you used to have some conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, that's gone. There is no overlap between the parties. They're totally separate, and they're more ideologically cohesive. Other professors have said that. That's what he's saying. So the polarization is worse because the parties are more polarized and concretized. However, vote-based measures are subject to whipping, and thus the need for other measures such as the linguistic measure I created and Genskal-Shapiro improved upon. I can't say from those measures since I haven't collected the data and checked it to see. If you mean ideological polarization, my guess is that it has declined. You now have, for example, people like Josh Hawley supporting the $15 minimum wage and decent-sized expansions of the UI system back during the height of COVID. Donald Trump has times said that he would be very opposed to defunding Medicare and Social Security. Again, we don't have a great measure for ideological polarization of legislators. The current measures really more measure partisan polarization. But my guess is, if anything, ideological polarization may be slightly in decline. Then you can look at state legislatures. Oklahoma is considering passing large expansions for the funding of public education, potential sign of decline in ideological polarization. However, there is a recent trend in the past few weeks of kicking out legislators or banning them from speaking in Georgia and Montana. So my guess is that these patterns of ideological polarization falling or not increasing, but partisan polarization is in decline and are matched at the state level. Finally, you can talk about voter polarization. We have a lot less information about voters. One aspect that we can measure is the spatial polarization is increasing. Voters of like mind live together to a greater extent than they do. Okay, so he's talking about the big sort. He's saying the big sort exists, and voters are more polarized because they're more sorted, aka the big sort. This professor is backing up the big sort. Measure so individuals more likely to be opposed to having their children date members of the opposing party. That's an indication of rising partisan polarization at the voter level. I do not think, though I haven't checked recently, that ideological polarization is much higher among voters, though sorting of voters, and thus the correlation between partisanship and ideology among voters has likely increased. Anyway, as I said, it's a complex question. So voters have sorted themselves out. Absolutely. And there is more polarization of that. But at the same time, he's saying that people are coming together on certain issues, like we've talked about. There's certain polls, and it shows that people on the left and the right come together for reasonable gun legislation, reasonable Social Security legislation, reasonable Medicare legislation, reasonable school legislation, etc. So you have these polls that show people kind of agree on issues generally. At the same time, you have a super polarized elite in Congress, and you have a polarized public that is geographically sorted from each other. So that's what the professor's saying. And we've heard versions of this. So there are polls that show people agree on certain issues. And then there's also the big sort that shows people have sorted themselves geographically. And then there is the fact that the politicians and the parties are more separated from each other than ever before. Those are all facts together. And he concludes with going, it's a complex question. You're right. All of these things are true at the same time. How do people have surveys that show that they agree on common basic directions and yet seem so polarized in how the people they elect react to each other and in where they live and the fact that they're choosing not to live with each other anymore? We'll leave it there. Thank you very much.